Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Law Enforcement and Racial Justice, a People for Effective Government online public forum event. My name is Mark Newbold, and I am a board member of PEG. I will be serving as the moderator for this evening's forum. I'm assisted by fellow PEG member and dear friend, Mark Kinney. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening.
And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. People for Effective Government, or commonly referred to as PEG, is a grassroots, nonprofit, Spokane-based nonpartisan coalition. Our mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing, which are fiscally responsible, ensure an adequate social safety net, and promote a civil society. We've been holding in-person forums and online events for almost 3 years. The members of PEG are committed to changing the current political climate in which our two major parties have become increasingly polarized. Through these forums, we are working to encourage sincere and civil debate about the challenges facing our nation and local community and about effective solutions to those challenges. If you are finding these events helpful, please consider joining as a member or making a donation to PEG. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization relying on membership dues and donations to cover our costs. Please visit our website at www.pegnow.org. Again, that's www.pegnow.org. This event is being videotaped and will be posted on our website in a week or two. As always, the views presented by our guest speakers are their own. As a nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor engages in political activity of any kind. Our audience this evening is encouraged to submit questions for this forum's panelists using the Zoom Q&A feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen under the Q&A button or function icon. Please keep them brief so we can get as many questions as time allows. And now it's an honor to welcome our panelists for this evening's public forum. City of Spokane Council member Betsy Wilkerson, Spokane NAACP First Vice President Curtis S. Robinson, former United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington, Bill Hislop, and City of Spokane Police Chief Craig Meidel. Welcome to you all, and thanks from PEG for participating as panelists for this evening's event. We've asked each of the panelists to offer remarks about recommendations made by the City of Spokane Use of Force Commission, created after the Otto Zem tragedy some years ago. What progress has been made implementing those recommendations, and what needs to be done going forward to improve racial and social justice in law enforcement. They also have been asked to comment on what the community's responsibilities are in improving relations with law enforcement and achieving racial and social justice, and speak about the challenges facing law enforcement agencies in terms of officer recruitment and retention, and the pressures that officers face both professionally and personally. After their remarks, there will be an opportunity for them to answer questions from the audience. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first panelist for this evening's forum. City of Spokane Council member Betsy Wilkerson grew up in Spokane and has strong family roots within District 2, which she represents on the City Council. She is proud to be the second African-American woman to serve as a council member in the city's 139-year history and has raised 2 children in the city. She owns a business in Browns Addition, and she's familiar with the volunteer and nonprofit sector, most recently serving as board chair of the Carl Maxey Center, leading 2 capital campaigns to raise funds for the center, which is named after the civil rights icon from Spokane. City Council member Wilkerson is a strong supporter of public education and institutions like community centers, nonprofits, and local business associations. because, as she says, community is where we find our strength. Welcome, City Council Member Wilkerson.
I did it. I unmuted myself. Thank you so much for inviting me this evening and allowing me to share my views. I really I know my title is City Council, but as a member, um, as a Black woman, as a mom, a community organizer, there's some just heartfelt issues and feelings around this topic tonight. So I'm looking forward to just an open and transparent dialogue between all of us. So in my role at City Council, having been here about a year and a half, I kind of stepped into a lot of things that had been brewing for a long time, especially around our police reform after the AutoZim. I can speak to AutoZim, not him particularly, but in my other life, I actually run a facility for the mentally ill. And so some of my clients knew AutoZim and what went down and the trauma that that had on them. And they still speak of that today. It was kind of a life-changing moment in that community. But as far as the city goes, there are just some historical bad acts that have happened around racial bias in our policing. And folks have just been traumatized. And I know everybody wants to get over it and to move on. And that happened yesterday. Let's start from today. But as we all know, when dealing with trauma, that's not how we are healed. And people need a voice to express that trauma, especially around racial justice. In our legislature this year, they took on some problems that we were addressing ourselves. So um, over in Olympia, when they passed House Bill 1054 around police tactics and equipment, that was a big piece of what we were trying to accomplish in Spokane. So that left us with other challenges um, to address together. And I say together because the police can't do it by themselves and neither can the community. It really is a joint effort going forward. So as I'm looking at from my position here, the police department in Spokane has come a long way. And we need to acknowledge it as a community. And I have said that to Chief Mile. And if I haven't said it lately, I will say it again here. Some changes has happened, but you know what? We still have a lot of work to do. And I once told Chief, I said, Chief, I am more than willing to celebrate all the fine officers that serve on the Spokane Police Department. But, there are some ones that are not fine. So, and we have some community members who are not fine. And we have to be willing to acknowledge that and call it out and then go forward from that. So from us, transparency is the biggest part. Community engagement is the biggest part. Communication, reconciliation, and we have to take this almost community by community because each community has had their own experience with the police, and they want those truthful, heartfelt conversations, and we just have to be willing to listen. And when I say we, I'm talking about the city and our role, and to hear and not be so defensive when we hear, because it's been painful for me to hear as a city council, as a Black person, as a city council member. It's been painful for me to hear some stories that are out there, and it's not every officer, but for the few that it is, it really is stymieing the growth of our community. So I just look forward to hear what the other guests have to say about that. But that was my impassioned speech around really where I'm coming from. And then I'll go more into where the city's at a little bit later. Thank you. You're on mute.
Okay, now we're back. Can you tell I have 1 foot in technology and 1 foot out? So now it's my pleasure to introduce our second panelist. Curtis S. Robinson serves as the Spokane NAACP first vice president and a commissioner for the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission. He is executive director for Revive CFRC, I Did Time, and serves on the boards of directors for Better Health Together, the advisory committee for the Spokane County Criminal Justice Administration, the Spokane Regional Health District COVID-19 Equity Task Force, and is Governor Inslee's appointee to the Hate Crimes Advisory Group, and a Smart Justice Spokane Executive Committee member. And I found it interesting in his bio that he records that he's a wildland firefighter of over 10 years and worked for the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, Spokane County Fire District, and is currently working as a fire contractor. Welcome, Mr. Robinson.
Well, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be here, and my son. So my son has joined us here this evening. You know, it's just an extreme honor to be involved with each and every one of you, especially not only your organization. Yes, son. But I see that yellow. All right. But with, of course, with Councilperson Wilkerson, Chief Meidel, and Mr. Hislop. So honored to be here. You know, as I'm coming into this conversation, you know, I'm just trying to be very intentional and mindful about the multiple nuances that Councilperson Wilkerson laid out. You know, it's a tough place for everybody. Changes on the horizon. It's being starkly called for. And what we're really being asked to do is to tread into a territory as an American community, as an American republic that we've never been before. Is how do we actually start manifesting those real core foundations of the American dream, where all people are created equal and treated as such by every facet of the American system. And that's just not been the case yet. It's been the words, but it hasn't been the reality, especially for our people of color. And so when it comes to, you know, these next evolutionary invitations for our criminal justice system and the law enforcement community, you know, it's a tough, awkward, challenging space, but it's a necessary one. And I know that the many organizations that I'm connected with, as well as our partners in this space, you know, it's how do we do so in a way that is most humanizing, and as Chief Meidel and I have talked about many times, that incorporates the conversation of the human being on both sides of the badge. So glad to be here, and thanks for having us.
Thanks, Mr. Robinson, and it's nice to have your grandson with you. Grandchildren are a blessing. I speak to that as being a grandfather as well. So thank you for coming tonight and participating. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our third panelist, Bill Hislop, a lifelong resident of Spokane, has a long history of community involvement and support. He recently served as the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington, and in that role was the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer in Eastern Washington, working closely with all federal, state, and local law enforcement. Having also served as U.S. Attorney from 1991 to 1993, he was the first person to serve twice in this manner. From 2012 to 2015, he was the Vice Chair of the City of Spokane Use of Force Commission, of which City Council member Wilkerson spoke about earlier, which was asked by the mayor to make recommendations to the city on law enforcement improvements following the AutoZone tragedy. Bill has practiced law in Washington for 41 years, a longtime principal at Lukens and Annis Law Firm, and is a past president of the Washington State Bar Association. Welcome, Bill Hislop.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It's an incredibly important discussion for not only those of us who are on the screen, but the entire community and the entire community of Spokane. What has occurred in our nation over the last year is staggering in terms of the George Floyd and related cases and I won't begin to list them, but there are a number of cases which has certainly raised the visibility of policing, racial justice, and the issues that we're discussing here tonight. And so I appreciate the invitation, Mark, to visit with the people online and with the fellow panelists. My experience is twofold. One is as serving as the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Washington, both in the early 90s, and then again more recently, and also in serving as the Vice Chair of the Spokane Use of Force Commission. I grew up in Spokane. I'm 70. I've spent my entire life here other than when I was away at college, and I love this community. I grew up in an environment where we respected police, where the police engendered that respect. And that's the type of relationship that I believe that we as a community need to have with our police department, and our police department needs to have with us. Whether it's a race issue, a gender issue, or any other type of discriminatory issue, no one, including the police department, wants to be challenged that they are not meeting the mark or the standard that is expected of them. But with that, we have a role as a community as well, as Councilwoman Wilkerson talked about. But I want to talk first about policing. I did, before tonight's forum, go back and look at the PEG video from last August of 2020, when both Doctors James and Dr. Vila talked about policing and the challenges that police departments face. And likewise, last month's video, which talked about many of those same issues. There is no question that I can't think of any profession out there that is more difficult or more stressful than being a police officer. We have great expectations for our police department. We have great expectations that they will protect all of us. They operate with limited resources, and they're seldom fully staffed. They make split-second decision-making. They are trained to do that in very difficult circumstances, whether it's dealing with drug or alcohol situations or mental situations, domestic abuse and high emotional situations. Think of an injured child or a drunk driver or an angered individual. They're dealing with pain and anger. They have to do that with compassion from case to case. They are dealing with the victimization of our community. And they have to do that responsibly while maintaining objectivity and the ability to cope personally with all of those sorts of issues. They live and they work in an environment of significant risk to themselves. They are held accountable for their decisions. They are incredibly stressful decision-making circumstances. We want them to do that in an unbiased and fair and just manner. At the same time, we know that today, as has been going on for some time, but is increasing, is that while we expect so much of our police department, at the same time, police agencies across the country, and certainly Spokane is not immune from this, are dealing with massive recruiting and retention issues because of the pressures that are put on them and because of the situations they are put into. Police have a higher degree of suicide and mental problems than almost any other profession. certainly the George Floyd case, and I'm going to say that as, and I don't mean to demean any of the other incidents across this country at all, has raised the visibility of our relationship with our police departments probably higher than it's been in my lifetime, and I suspect even more. That's both good and bad, because we need to have a conversation about what's the role of police in our community. We also need to have a conversation about what is our role as citizens of the community, as political leaders of the community, and our responsibility to stand up and publicly support the police. The level of trust of the community is directly dependent upon these things. Both the community has to trust their police, and the police have to know that the community has trust in them. Dr. Vila last August talked about policing being an incredibly complex topic, because we expect the police to follow the rules. We expect the police to enforce the rules and laws that our legislature, our city, and others adopt, and we delegate that enforcement to them. That enforcement, as I said, can be very hazardous, and we expect the police to be held accountable. Mark, you sent out in advance of this the principles of Sir Robert Peel about policing from 1829 that are as valid today as your prior speakers or prior forums have talked about, that the basic mission is to prevent crime and disorder and whatnot. And we have to have this kind of discussion. But in doing that, we've got to also realize what's going on and put it in context of what has occurred here in Spokane. Spokane is unlike many of the other communities in the nation that we read about in the newspaper, or we see things going on the nightly news. Spokane has been out in front for some time, has been on the cutting edge of police practices and implementing best practices. In March 18, 2006, Officer Carl Thompson responded to an attempted call for an attempted robbery at an ATM near a Zip Trip convenience store on North Division. That encounter with Otto Zim, who was seen entering the Zip Trip, ultimately led to baton strikes, tasers, and other force that was used to subdue Mr. Zim. Less than 2 days later, Otto Zim died at the Deaconess Medical Center, and his death was ruled a homicide by the Spokane Medical Examiner. Ultimately, there was a criminal prosecution, and on November 2nd, 2011, a federal jury convicted Mr. Zim of violating, convicted Officer Thompson of violating Mr. Zim's civil rights on one count of obstructing justice, and he was sentenced to 51 months in federal prison. That followed that there was a civil suit by the Zim family against the city of Spokane, and in August of 2012, that was settled by the city for $1.67 million payment to the Zim family, plus agreement and commitments by the city to include funds for crisis intervention training for the police, funds for implementing new policies regarding the use of force, and for the creation of a permanent memorial to Mr. Zim. Through that whole process, and as the councilwoman talked about, there's been great conversation and attention to that case. Mayor David Condon in January 2012 established the Spokane Use of Force Commission, and it was chaired by the former dean of the Gonzaga Law School and the executive vice president, then executive vice president of Gonzaga University, Marty Martin. Ivan Bush, who was the retired Chief Equity Officer for the Spokane School District, served. Susan Hammond was a former Director of Outpatient and Psychology Services at Spokane Mental Health, which, as I understand, is part of Frontier Behavioral Health. And the retired Washington Supreme Court Chief Justice Gary Alexander served on it. And I was asked to serve as the vice chair. Held multiple public meetings and hearings and interviewed people, sought out research, conducted interviews, had the benefit of work of consultants. A great deal of work went into it, and ultimately the commission issued a report with 26 recommendations in the areas of culture of the Spokane Police Department, the Spokane police policies and practices, citizen oversight, and recommendations for the city administration. Out of those 26 recommendations, as an example, one of the recommendations, which has been implemented by the police department, is to make crisis intervention training mandatory for all officers from the chief on down. Previously had been voluntary. There were a whole host of recommendations that were made. And I'm very pleased that in the reports by the police department and whatnot, they have implemented, I believe, all of those or nearly all of those recommendations. But the police department didn't stop there. In 2014, after the request by the former chief for a review and audit by the Department of Justice Community Policing Program, there was a report issued, the Collaborative Reform Model, a review of use of force policies, processes, and practices. I want to say it was a 132-page report. Again, a great deal of work was put into that by the Department of Justice and by its consultant. And the purpose was to look at the use of force policies by the city and its procedures compared with national best practices. And that's the standard we look at. What's the national standard for policing? Are we reaching that? Can we do more? Should we do more? And there were a series of recommendations there as well. Both reports talked about community engagement as being critically important. And I know from working with the police department as U.S. attorney, both back in the 90s and more recently, that we are very blessed in Spokane to have a police administration currently led by Chief Meidel and his command staff that very much wants to and works to engage with the community and asks for accountability on the part of the community to support the police department. One of my personal concerns is today, because of the national tide and the national issues we're dealing with, there is more discussion about what the police should be doing, could be doing, how we're going to make the police change, and not enough discussion about our role as citizens to support our police. Remember, none of this occurs in a vacuum. Being a police officer, a great deal is expected of that person, and we want to provide them with the tools and the ability to carry out the functions that we ask of them. Spokane, if you go back to the August 2020 video, Mark, that PEG sponsored with Dr. Vila and Dr. James, they said at the end of that, at the conclusion in the Q&A portion, that Spokane has really done an effective job at building relationships. Those are hard, and they are hard discussions to have, but they are very important to have. But they also said that we are different, and we are lucky here in Spokane to have community engagement and the discussions that we have. In my experience, our Spokane Police Department works to implement best practice policies. It works to engender and deserve community support. These are very, very difficult times for policing nationally. As U.S. Attorney, I worked with all law enforcement at federal, state, and local level throughout Eastern Washington and know the issues that many of the local departments deal with day in and day out. I can tell you that the Spokane Police Department is way up here, and we should be applauding them and applauding the good things that they are doing and speaking up about that at the same time that we are engaging with them on what are best practices. How can we maintain the best police force that we can maintain? How can we not step over the line of being too critical and expecting more than is reasonable? As a result of the very difficult times that Spokane has endured from the AutoZim case through today, great advances have been made and great advances will continue to be made. Through all of that, my experience is that, yes, every once in a while, there's going to be a bad cop. Every once in a while, there's a bad attorney. Every once in a while, there's a bad member of the city council. You pick the field and you can find a bad apple, and those situations have to be dealt with. But 99.999% of the officers on the Spokane Police Department, where I have the most experience, want to do the very best that they can, the most professional job that they can do, even under the very difficult, trying circumstances within which they work. They want to have the training and have the resources that the training can be provided for them and the equipment so that they have the tools with which to carry out the very difficult tasks that we delegate to them in terms of enforcing our laws. And they want to have the trust and respect of our community that they serve. And remember with that, every police officer is a member of this community as well. They care as deeply about this community as do you and I. And finally, those police officers want to do their job, but they want to go home safely at night to their families, to have the support of their spouses and their families for the dangerous duties they carry out each and every day for every one of us. I'm convinced nothing is ever perfect, and we have to have these discussions, and they should be continuing discussions. But by and large, the Spokane Police Department has made great advancements in the last 10 years and will continue to, and the Spokane Police Department deserves our trust and our respect. They work hard. They work to stay on the cutting edge of good police practices. And we need to do our part. And our part is to support them and to invite them for that engagement. Not to say you need to talk to us, but to invite them for that engagement. So when talking about the issues and the national issues that we're dealing with, it's a two-sided coin. These are important discussions about racial justice, about fairness. They are important discussions to have, but they also have to occur in the context of what we have. And here in Spokane, we are very fortunate. We have a lot to be blessed about. So I encourage the listeners and viewers here tonight to thank the police. It's as easy as waving to them. It's as easy as saying thank you for doing a tough job. It's as easy as smiling and to send a note of appreciation. They need to know that they have our support as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Hislop, very much for participating this evening, and we'll look forward to some more comments, remarks from you later in the program. Our fourth and final panelist for this evening's forum is the City of Spokane's Police Chief, Craig Meidel, and welcome, Chief Meidel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those kind of words, Bill. Despite the leadership at the top, yes, we do have a very good department, so thank you for that. So in communications before we started with Mark, the couple things he wanted me to make sure that I covered, and then obviously turn it over to questions from the audience. Let me start out by saying I had shoulder surgery about a month ago. I'm dressed down. I have my arm in a sling, so that's why I'm dressed the way I am. My right arm's in a sling, so I apologize for my appearance. Where to start? So much information, so many different things going on, right? One of probably the best place for me to start is I would like to start by saying I've said since day one of this position, when Mayor Condon asked me to assume the chief position, we're not perfect, we're going to make mistakes. And what I told the media at that time was, when our officers make mistakes, we will hold them accountable. And regardless of how unpopular I may be internally, when our officers engage in misconduct, I will hold them accountable. Likewise, if our officers do engage in conduct that some may not like, but the officer did not engage in misconduct and was doing their job, I will support that officer regardless of any kind of damage that I may take as well. So the message I have said to the community from day one is we are not perfect. I'm certainly not perfect. We're all going to make mistakes, and that has kept me humble. And anytime I try to start thinking, we're doing pretty darn good, the good Lord has come along and found a way to humble me. So I think I'm permanently humbled now. So I just want to go over real quick, since the hot topic right now nationally, locally here as well, is police reform. Obviously, we have a lot of pokers in the fire right now as a city. We have police reform, we have homelessness, we have drug addiction, property crimes, crimes of violence, hiring challenges in hiring. We have businesses that want to open again. We have businesses that are struggling to get people to work in their businesses. So there's a whole gamut of things. The Spokane Police Department has many issues, all equally important to different aspects of the community. This one right now, though, is obviously of national interest as well as local interest. So let me start off by just talking about the last 10 years or so. I know Bill touched on many of them, and I'm going to go through this quickly. And the only reason I'm going to go through it quickly is one of the things that I realized when I took the helm is that we absolutely not would like to get, we need that community support, and we need that community engagement as well. Without the community, and Sir Robert Pule even discusses that in his principles, without the community support and community engagement, we are not effective. So we have made great strides under the last chief. I have tried to continue and amplify those strides that he made as well. So you heard Mr. Hislop talk about the 2013, the Use of Force Commission, 26 recommendations, all of those were implemented. So this was about 8 years ago. The topics that we implemented, he went over. I won't rehash those. Then about a year later, the Department of Justice was asked to come in under collaborative reform. We were only the second jurisdiction in the entire nation that engaged in collaborative reform with the Department of Justice. And really what we asked them to primarily look at, by we all say Chief Stroud, is we want you to look at our use of force practices, policies, engagement related to use of force, and also civilian oversight as well. Since at that time, civilian oversight wasn't quite as popular as it is today. So the Department of Justice spent about a year collecting data, interviewing, putting together the report. They came out with a total of 42 recommendations. 4 of those recommendations were for civilian oversight, 38 were specific to SPD. The vast majority of those evolved around use of force as well. So again, that was about 7 years ago, Department of Justice, collaborative reform. And then in May of 2015, many of you, if not most of you, know about President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. There were 6 pillars that this task force, a cross spectrum of different fields related to keeping communities safe, participated in this task force. They came out with these 6 pillars. We implemented anywhere from 7 to 15 different initiatives under each one of those pillars. And again, that was 2015, so about 6 years ago. 2015 is really when we hit full swing with our body cameras. We were at the time, I believe we may still actually be the largest department. Yeah, I know we are in the city where every officer has a body camera. It's part of the policy, it's mandated. So every officer has a body camera with him. That took the transparency that we have and did achieve to a whole new level where we can go to an incident where there's been an allegation or complaint, say, let's see what happened. So that was, again, in 2015, the same year as the President Obama's task force initiatives that we really pushed hard. We have participated in academic studies with 4 different universities, including the Arizona State University. They studied officer behavior as it relates to body-worn cameras, including community behavior. What they wanted to see is there a change in behavior of the officers or the community based on the body cameras. We've engaged in training with Washington State University. In fact, right now we currently have a study underway with Wazoo that is measuring officers' interactions specific to domestic violence calls. So a lot of agencies, they're always worried about their dirty laundry. They're worried about, man, if we look under the stone, what are we going to find? I have always said, I want to turn over all the stones because I can tell the community that, yes, we want to look at this when we want to get better. I don't want to be surprised. I would rather be the one who initiates that so that we can discover and say, this is what we initiated. And these are things that we're going to do. So Wazoo, again, looking at domestic violence calls, they have the body camera. And part of that study is what is the officer's behavior and how may that impact whether force is used or not used, or necessary or not necessary as well. So again, use of force, we take that very serious. They're looking at a prong related specifically to domestic violence. We've worked with Eastern Washington University on a number of studies, as well as Gonzaga University. So one of the things that I believe was last year, this warrior mindset for police officers was a kind of the buzz phrase across the nation. The Spokane Police Department falls under the Washington State Training Commission. The Washington State Training Commission is centralized, and that was decided, I don't know, Kurt, you're on the Washington State Training Commission, you'll probably know when that was decided, but I think early 70s, 71, 72, they basically decided instead of each department doing their own training, we're going to centralize it as a state so we can have the consistent training standards across the entire state. So you cannot be a law enforcement officer in the state of Washington without the Training Commission's blessing and certification. We are the only satellite training facility in the entire state. The Spokane Police Academy, we train deputies, we train police officers, Fish and Game, Wildlife, Gambling Commission, just a whole gamut of different entities that have a commission in Spokane. We only get to do that if we operate under the Washington State Training Commission's umbrella and follow their training curriculum as well. So how does that tie into the warrior mindset? The Training Commission for decades, this was initiated under Director Sue Rohr, who's retired. Their philosophy is training the guardians of democracy. And they use what's called a blue courage philosophy. And that blue courage is not necessarily physical courage, running into the gun battle, running into the fight, getting shot and stabbed. It's really more about moral courage, integrity. It's that type of courage. So we fall under the training the guardians of democracy. Additionally, many of you know about the Initiative 940 that was passed. That basically required, again, this is for every single commissioned officer in the state of Washington, 200 hours in every single police academy, mandatory de-escalation training and mental health training in the law enforcement academy. So it went for probably, and I'm spitballing here, but probably 40 to 50 hours of training because there's so much training that goes on. The police academy is 4.5 months long. It used to be 3 months long. So we probably quadrupled the amount of de-escalation and mental health training. That became mandatory at the end of December 2019. One of the things that we did as a Spokane Police Department as well, though, is that we invited community of color to come and talk to our cadets after the basic academy. And we wanted the community of color to come in and talk about their experiences with law enforcement, or even their perception or what they think when they see a police officer, what they're feeling when they have some kind of discourse with a police officer. So we've invited community of color to come in and talk to our recruits at the end of every single academy before they go out on the street. We've invited community of color, Pastor Sean Davis, Walter Kinrich, Leon Covington, and many more to actually come, and we've carved out blocks of time at in-service for them to come and actually have smaller roundtable discussions. So we did that for a couple of years as well. So the Washington State Training Commission mandates 24 hours of what they call in-service training every single year. That means that's a minimum. It costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of person power to get every single commissioned officer, all the way from the chief to the newest graduate, into in-service for 3 days a year. It's very expensive, very time consuming. We obviously take officers off the street to go to that training as well. Topics that we cover were legal updates, procedural justice, officer wellness, defensive tactics, emergency vehicle operations, policy updates, firearms training, mandated CJTC training. We've rolled de-escalation training into our in-services for the last 3 or so years. However, Initiative 940, that was passed overwhelmingly by the state, has now mandated a minimum of 40 hours of continuing ongoing training every 3 years. So we went from 24 hours of mandatory training every year, add 40 hours divided by 3, so about another 13 hours. We've almost increased mandatory training on topics by about 50%. And this is required every 3 years, that 40 hours in 3 years. So there's a lot of material in there that they mandate that we basically are required by the law to teach our officers on now. And I'm just going to go over them very, very quickly. Obviously, patrol tactics. By patrol tactics, de-escalation, using cover, sometimes leaving the incident, getting more officers, calling more resources, including maybe some of your mental health professionals. We're mandated to train on the historical intersection of race and policing. Mandatory training on alternatives to booking. Mandatory training on explicit and implicit bias. Understanding local cultures. Managing the pace of an interaction, managing the distance, procedural justice, learning about the historical intersection of race and policing, the experience of Black Americans then and now, including the institution of slavery through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, mass incarceration, the role of impacts of police in schools, the ongoing influence of race relations, strategies to reconcile past injustices, the importance of fair and impartial training, also understanding how culture and differences in experiences, histories, and social norms impact community perceptions of law enforcement, learning about the history and interaction of law enforcement with LGBTQ+ communities, immigrant and refugee communities, and those with limited English. I'm going over all of this because I don't think a lot of people necessarily know what's in there. This is all mandatory training, 40 hours minimum every 3 years. How to interact with people who have barriers to hearing, systemic challenges facing indigent populations, the nature of crimes and poverty, cycle of recidivism, examining alternatives to jail, booking, arrest, impacts on members of the community and public, learning about the history of police interaction with Native American communities, mandatory first aid when safe to do so, and now a minimum of 40 hours of crisis intervention training, which is really teaching our officers how to engage more effectively and incorporate de-escalation tactics with those who may be in a mental crisis. So we already did the 40-hour training, mandatory CIT training, as you heard Mr. Hislop say. We were doing that for probably the last 8 years or so anyways, but that's now mandatory across the state. So I just want to cover that as well. And when it comes to the training that is mandated by Initiative 940 as of about 15 months ago or so. So those are some of the things that the Spokane Police Department for 8 years, again, in that effort to engage with the community, to stay engaged and to actually amplify that engagement. We have a police activities league every summer, started with one event, basketball at one park. Fast forward 8 years, it's now at 3 parks, 8 different events. And prior to COVID, we served 750 youth in that police activities league during the summer, 6 weeks. We're going to shorten a little bit this week or this year because all the COVID stuff. At its peak, in 2019, 750 kiddos participated. Over a third of those self-identified as community of color as well. We participated with Pastor Sean Davis, probably 3.5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. We did 8 community forums across the entire city, trying to connect and engage with community of color. So we did one a month for about 8 months. We have a police advisory committee that has a cross spectrum of the entire community of color impacted community. We meet monthly. They're my sounding board. They're my counselors, my guides. They give me input. And the expectation is they'll bring their concerns and frustrations to me. I will get information, I will share information with them, and they'll bring it back to their community as well. I think it was last year, I mandated we rotate a command staff member through every NAACP meeting. Before, it used to be mainly me and maybe, quite frankly, a couple of my executive staff, my wife, who is the captain patrol. We went to anything and everything we could, especially trying to really connect with the community of color, let them know we're there for them, we care about them, you know, fundraisers, banquets, meetings, forums, and we went to all of that. And one of the things, and again, mind you, I'm a slow learner, but it really started dawning on me as well, is that, you know, I need my command staff to kind of start hearing these stories and experiencing this as well. So I think it was actually when Kurt Robinson might have been the NAACP president. I said, hey, I'd like to have one of our command staff rotate through. They need to hear these stories as well. We rotate a captain through so that they get to hear those stories as well. They need to hear that. They need to experience it. It doesn't do any good if it's just me and maybe one of my executive staff members and my wife as well. So we've been doing that for, Kurt could tell you, a year and a half now, something like that. We work with the MLK Center. We actually had an officer assigned there. She is retired, going on to be a school counselor, but we had one of our community engagement officers stationed there. We've engaged with food distribution, fun nights, basketball nights, various things at the MLK Center. The YPI, Youth and Police Initiative, this is a program where we, prior to COVID, would take about 12 or so, I guess you call maybe some at-risk youth. And I say at-risk because we would work with the counselors at the school, the principals, other staff members, teachers, to get kids that are at a crossroads. They're kind of showing some disturbing behavior, and at that crossroads where they're either going to say, okay, you know what, I get it, I want to make good decisions and healthy decisions, or they're going to continue making unhealthy decisions. So they typically recommend those to us. So that's a week long. We cycle through all the different high schools. We've done it at Crosswalk, we've done it at Excelsior, and that's 1 week where we sit and try to build bridges with the kiddos, and they share their experiences, we share our experiences. I've been to one of those, and it was probably more impactful for me than it was the kiddos. I think we all forget, and I'm just kind of looking at the screen here, and you're all like me, no offense to the long of the tooth, the stresses our kids go through right now. If you remember when we were growing up, we had 3 channels. If you wanted to change the channel, you had to get up and rotate the knob. And at noon, the Star Spangled Banner played and the TV was off. You didn't have 500 channels, your smartphone, Netflix, HBO Now, and all of that. The stresses they have now are just unbelievable. And we wanted to connect with them, and we needed to connect with them because I'd even forgotten a lot of that stuff as well. We've done the Police Activities League specifically for the Salish School, for the Native Project. We're doing Day with the Police for the Asian Pacific Islander community this month. Done backpacks for kids, winter coat giveaway, shop with a cop, coffee with a cop. We have a co-deployed team with a behavioral health unit assigned out of our downtown precinct. This is actually a interagency program where we work with the Spokane County Sheriff's Office, the Spokane Valley and SPD. They assign an actual counselor to the officer or deputy, and they respond to mental health calls across the entire county. Extremely effective. More need than what they could possibly meet. We just requested a grant through WASPIC to try to double the size of that unit. And if we are able to double that unit, they will stay busy. That's how much mental health issues that we're having in the city of Spokane. We also developed a program with Eastern State Hospital so that those who are about to be released, talk to an officer. He starts with plain clothes, just talking to him. They don't know who he is. And gradually it evolves to he explains who he is. And they're able to have a conversation with some of these folks that have had some pretty serious mental health issues, schizophrenia, bipolar, and they develop a relationship, and they're able to talk about, here's what we do, here's why we do it. So that's another great program. Let me go back to the behavioral health unit as well. We had a Sergeant Tony Lockhart, who teaches at the Training Commission, and talked about our co-deployed team with Frontier Behavioral Health. He said, I'd like to say SPD, but it's SO in the Valley as well. He said, we are light years ahead of most everybody else with crisis intervention training, and we are adopters of getting the co-responders very, very early. So that's in a nutshell. And then lastly, I'm going to just throw out, in February of 2019, as a follow-up to our collaborative reform, Department of Justice Community-Oriented Policing Services did a follow-up on our collaborative reform. And it was a wonderful woman named Tawana Waugh, who asked if she could do a follow-up. She worked with us as the DOJ liaison, and her comments were, The title of the article, they picked it, not us, was Spokane Police Department Reform at its Best, highlighted SPD's, quote, commitment to excellence and included, quote, significant and permanent improvements. Additionally, she noted that SPD's use of force training requirements exceed accreditation standards in CRI-TA, which is the Collaborative Reform Initiative, DOJ Collaborative Reform recommendations. We are accredited. We are only one of 25, part of the 25% of the jurisdictions in the state of Washington that are accredited through WASPIC as well. So all of this, and there's more. I'm not going to read it all to you. I've got pages.
Chief
Yes.
Meidel, this is Mark Newbold. Could you repeat the report, the name of the report that you just referenced about the department there?
From the Department of Justice.
Yeah. Mhm.
It's called Spokane Police Department Reform at its Best.
And that was issued by the Department of Justice?
By the Department of Justice, that's correct.
When was that issued?
2019.
2019. Okay, thank you. And this is a good segue into our question and answer segment of the presentation tonight. And Chief Meidel, I was remiss, I didn't properly introduce you in some of the things that you've done with your career. And I won't go into a great detail, but I think the audience would be interested to know that you really rose through the ranks. I mean, you did it kind of the hard way, if that's a fair way to describe it. You started out in patrol, became including supervisory position in patrol. Then you were a detective, sergeant, lieutenant, precinct captain, assistant chief of police, and then you became, of course, the chief of police. And then you've also served on SWAT team. Is that correct?
Couple of years, yeah.
So you've been involved with that. And then I would be remiss without acknowledging your service to our country. You served in combat as a U.S. Marine during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, as I understand it. So and you have a BA from the Central Washington University with a major in law and justice and a minor in sociology. And then you completed the organizational leadership program from Gonzaga University, as I understand it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, great. Now I understand that Mr. Robinson will be leaving us at 8:30 for another commitment. So I would like to start off our questions this evening with a question to him, and then the rest of the panelists can join in his remarks. So Mr. Robinson, as I understand it, you serve on the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so the question I have to you is, from your perspective, what improvements, if any, need to be made in the training of law enforcement officers that is not being done now, or that is not being done adequately?
Thank you, son. I see that. So yeah, and thank you, son. You coming over? Come on over here. So just for the record, this is my son, not my grandson.
Okay.
I was right, I'm blessed. Hey, I'm like, hey, got a 3-year-old at this stage of the game. It's awesome.
Keeps you young.
But what we're really looking at is how to, number one, how to incorporate the very complex series of legislation that has come through, and what that really kind of pans out and looks to as far as the Criminal Justice Training Commission, its ability to not only implement the previous WAC oversights that it's had, but now the very extensive calls out that multiple initiatives have engaged that particular commission in doing it. So it's going to be, good job, son. It's going to call for a wide array of training oversights for law enforcement, more than they've already got. And it's a very, extensive list that both Mr. Hyssop and Chief Meidel have laid out. And so when we look at that, without getting into that, because we could eat up an hour easy just talking about all these initiatives and the impact that it's going to have and trying to figure that out. We spent 2 hours talking about that at the Criminal Justice Training Commission meeting earlier today. Okay, son, bring it over here. Okay, thank you, son. Okay, thank you. Got my coffee. That the, the real call that, as far as I can see, like the overarching call is to move in kind of a different arena. I think it really kind of moves towards the whole philosophy that Sue Raw has really fought to implement during her tenure as the director of the CJTC, and that is, this guardianship mentality, right? And what we really need and what community is really calling for is we're calling for more servants than we are warriors, right? And what we have is we have a historical culture and momentum. Okay, son, we have a historical momentum and culture that's been trained up in a lot of the warrior mentality. And I have to say this, and so I'm gonna say it, is that as we were talking about, thank you, son, as we were talking about the support, obviously, and well needed for law enforcement, it's also important to acknowledge why that's an issue today. Right? That it's not an issue because people are just tired of having law enforcement tell them what to do. No, there have been some very heinous acts that have been committed on communities of color historically for a sustained period of time. And now those acts have been elevated to a higher level. But the reality is that this stuff has been here the entire time. And all you have to do is ask any impacted community of color, and we will tell you what's been going on the entire time. And so what is really important is to really understand that that's why one of the main reasons why we're where we're at today and what we're really looking for, thank you, son, is for law enforcement to help and our human family, thank you, son, to shift out of the mode that they have been in, that where we as an American system have failed them because we set them up to operate that way. By the lack of accountability, by the lack of proper training, by the lack of really saying, hey, we expect humane service instead of some of this other stuff that we've seen by far too many bad actors, right? And that's not to sweep aside the awesome individuals that we have serving our public in that capacity. Yet the reality is, it's just like Chris Rock said that one time. It's like when you're flying a plane, you don't really want to hear about the one bad pilot. We just have one bad pilot once in a while and the plane's going to crash. Boom, right on cue, son. And
maybe, Mr. Robinson, we can ask the other panelists now to comment on the idea of servanthood versus warrior approach to the duties of a law enforcement officer. And so I'll ask the other panelists to contribute their remarks and thoughts on that. Thank you for bringing that issue forward.
You're welcome. Thanks for letting me get there with son.
Oh, I just have to jump in on that because I wrote down Bill's bad apple comment. And the challenge is for the BIPOC community, for the LGBTQ plus community, we don't know who's going to show up. Is it going to be the one bad apple? And that is the fear in the community that we need to help overcome. That's the real fear. I don't know who's going to show up at my door or at the car accident or what their perspective is. And when we are dealing with people, we know that's a heavy lift. That's just mental health right there. But again, do not overlook the historical context and what the community see every day. No, it's not happening in Spokane every day, but it is happening, and we cannot have our head in the sand that it could not happen here. And yes, they've come a long way. They've done some great things. And Chief, I applaud you. But we have, in my opinion, this model of community engagement is not working for everyone. So can we take that model and look at it again and re-engage? Because we just can't meet with them once and not engage. It is an ongoing conversation because there are still folks who feel like they have not been heard. And why is that? And those conversation needs to be in their communities. I know there was courageous conversation here at City Hall recently. Kudos to the mayor on that, but they need to go where people live. And our police officers need to be in our neighborhood. So I'm a big fan of neighborhood policing. And let's remember this mindset of they're not guilty first, and then we got to prove them innocent. We really should have that. They're innocent and then go from there. But there is a real fear, and we have to acknowledge that. And yes, we are imperfect people. Usually when the police engages at imperfect times in our life, but with the power that that badge carries, yeah, the expectation has to be higher. It just has to be higher.
And Betsy, as we're pivoting, and I know that there's other panels here, but one of the things I want to really kind of highlight too is the duality of what we're dealing with, because we're dealing with people within law enforcement who have not been held accountable. And even though we've had champions like Chief Milo, because I've seen him try to hold some officers accountable, and I've turned around and seen the union using issues like qualified immunity and mediation to turn around and put them right back in the office. And so that does not send a good message when it comes to the BIPOC communities who have a tendency to be disproportionately impacted. And as far as you can see across any media spectrum, sometimes outright assassinated by other police officers. And so we just have to understand that that's the baseline reality of where we're truly at. And so as much as we need to support our officers, we also need to understand that part of that support means accountability, because I know I've looked at the stats. I know the suicide rates are off the chart. There's a reason for that. And some of that is that cognitive dissonance that comes with that duality of high expectation and almost zero accountability. You can't do that to any human being and expect them to be successful at what they're doing.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment on what's been said here the last few minutes?
I'll weigh in real quick. So yeah, you know, one of the things is if you look back to really last year, around March of last year, where you really started to see the state shut down, right, because of COVID. Actually, probably the majority of the nation shut down as well. So, you know, one of the things that was challenging is for the last 14 or so months, when you have these raw emotions and these intense emotions occurring, we weren't allowed to get in groups. We weren't allowed to meet in groups. And I think while Zoom and WebEx and those things have always existed, I'll be honest, I never used them until COVID. I knew they were there, but I thought I'd never use them. So it took a while, I feel like, for technology of doing these types of things. I heard someone once refer to it as like the Brady Bunch meeting, because we're all in boxes and can look up at the next person. And that's adequate, but you're not really going to work through, you know, a lot of these emotions and have honest conversations from both sides to the same degree that you will person to person. So my point being that ability for law enforcement to stay engaged like they had been, or engaged like they would like to, was really hampered a lot by the COVID. But you know, one of the things that I believe is that, you know, the truth is usually somewhere in the middle, and it may go one way or the direction as well. And I would be remiss, the stones will cry out if I don't say that, you know, most of our officers, and I'm not going to say all, because we don't hire perfect people. We just don't. And, you know, most of our officers, they want to show up, take the call, and go on to the next call. We're a call-driven agency. We respond to over 200 incidents a day, and every person we contact, for the most part, is a victim. Something bad has happened to them. They have experienced trauma, and being that bulwark against the trauma they've experienced because someone has victimized them. And we deal with victims all day. You know, that takes a toll on officers. So officers can get hardened. They can get jaded. You know, I think that I saw one statistic that said as many as a third of officers on departments are suffering PTSD. Now PTSD, normally people are thinking, you know, gun to the head. That happens unequivocally. Everybody would agree that happens, but PTSD also manifests in unhealthy behavior, taking risks at work, drinking, high divorce rates, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a full gamut of issues that are occurring. And again, I am not trying to ruffle feathers at all, but I need to be honest when I say, you know, I walked into Wellesley and Madison about 3 weeks ago, anyways, a few weeks ago, to get an energy drink, and saw a African-American woman at the cash register, a 12, 13-year-old African-American, her son. And as walked in, I'm waving to him. And, you know, I'm in uniform, clearly identified as police officer. I just waving to him, and he's looking at me, just staring at me. And I just keep waving, you know, and although I had my mask on, you could see the eyes that I'm smiling behind my eyes. And I'm saying this because these are the conversations we need to have. As he's staring at me, and I'm waving to stare, and I can see this, the stare turns into a glare. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, what kind of stories are being shared with him about law enforcement at the age of 12 when I'm going in, and I am really, and I do spend effort to try to connect with community of color, and I'm trying to connect with this 12-year-old in waving, and that stare turns into glare. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm not trying to diminish all the past transgressions, but I'll also say that officers also go and they're trying hard on these calls to connect as well. And it's not uncommon, possibly because of the history, that they are met with a certain level of animosity and hostility as well. And being biological creatures, that can have an impact on them. That can have an impact on their mentality, their behavior, their willingness to connect, their desire to connect, their fear of even wanting to connect and not necessarily disengage because they don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to get accused of something. So and that ties into the community piece as well, is we have work to do, and we have a track record of doing it. We will continue to do it. We have a huge piece of ownership of this. Law enforcement is the most visual part of government that has the authority to take away someone's freedom, up to and including endorsement from the government to use force. Huge responsibility. I tell every officer before I hire them, I'm the final interview, and I've declined on officers. I've sat across from them, I've listened to them, I'm like, I don't think you're going to take us the direction we're going to go. But I tell every single one of them, I am a believer to whom much is given, much is required. You have tremendous amount of authority. Because of that, you are held to a higher standard, both on duty and off duty. And you have to understand, you live in a fishbowl when you become a police officer, and you can do something off duty in any other profession. You keep your job. As a police officer, you're going to be gone. I also relay to them that, and this is every single new candidate. I have a printout of the sheet, so I cover all of these. I tell them, we as an agency use force because we have to, not because we can. There are many, many times where you are justified by policy or by the law in using force. I said, I would rather have you spend 20 minutes talking someone into handcuffs or calling for more backup so that they know, hey, we're here. You have to go to jail. The community expects us to arrest you, and the law mandates that. Spend 20 minutes talking them into handcuffs instead of 2 minutes fighting them into handcuffs. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. One being community expectations have evolved. I've been saying that for 5 years. I think the department understands that, but changing culture takes a while. You don't turn a battleship on a dime as well. So all of that to summarize and say that we obviously have work to do in this community. And to Councilwoman Wilkerson's point, we're here. The last 14 months have been stymied because of COVID. We've been wanting to reach out. We needed to reach out at the peak of this thing. And now that things are starting to relax a little bit, I think you're going to see more of those opportunities present themselves.
And Chief Vital, and panelists, we've received a couple of questions from the audience that relate to the discussion we've had just the last couple of minutes. One of the questions is, relationships always go both ways. And while there's undoubtedly work that law enforcement agencies and officers can do to improve relations with the communities they serve, there is presumably also work that our neighborhoods and residents can do to improve those relations as well. And I'll ask each of the panelists, from your perspective, what would be most helpful in that regard?
Oh, let me go. Can't wait. I think as a community,
Mr. Robinson, could you mute for while you're off? Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
So in the African-American community, as all communities of color, we are doing our own work too, working through our challenges and issues and our own experiences. And we realize that, yeah, communication goes both ways. And we have to do outreach and invite them in, them being law enforcement, into our community. A Herculean effort for us is we have been on the outside for so long. In many ways, we are really afraid to come in. So we have to get over some of our own challenges. Um, and we recognize that. And those conversations are going on in the communities of color as to how do we engage with the system and rebuild that trust, that we haven't been there, and rebuild that trust and acknowledge our lived experiences at the same time, because they are there. And to Chief, the young man, it's not just what their parents have taught them. When you said TV is 24/7 and they see the world, the news from around the country and around the world, it's hard to distinguish. Well, just because it happened in Tennessee doesn't mean it won't happen in Spokane. And so that's just our reality. And so it will be difficult work, but I know there are some conversations starting. Uh, I know I have committed personally to helping to bridge some of those bridges. So we just need some more bridge builders and people who are willing, not just folks of color, but dominant culture who are willing to be vulnerable and step out there with us in this conversation and this healing process.
You know, Mark, all of us tend to sometimes fear the worst. And I think we have to all fight against that. And the councilwoman talked about some of that, some of those challenges. One suggestion certainly is not wait for a formal meeting or a community meeting or an opportunity, is simply when you see a cop, talk to a cop, and you will find out that they are people too, that they care just as much as you do, and that they are good people. And it's that personal engagement that's going to build trust. If we don't talk to one another, then those divides and those fears or whatnot are going to grow. We simply have to have that kind of communication. And it's is important for us as citizens to reach out as much as it's important for the police to reach out. We simply cannot wait for the limited number of police that are available at any point in time. We have a responsibility. We have a duty that we have of our own. And let me give you another example. Chief, I can't remember the exact date, but I believe it's August 12th, is National Night Out Against Crime. And there is a website for that. And people should go to that website and sign up to have some of their neighbors in, and to invite a police officer or the fire department, any first responder to come and talk about their services, answer questions, but simply get to know one another. Those sorts of things are good opportunities to build trust and to break down the barriers that we're talking about here tonight. But we have that responsibility to step forward.
Kurt, are you going to go first? I'll say something real quick. First of all, I appreciate the question, because I truly do. I think we've all acknowledged we have to work together. One of the things that I think is important, when I first became the chief, obviously it was typically the chief and maybe some of the executive staff that go to a lot of these community meetings, and they're the tip of the department in dealing with these issues, especially the racial tension, the bias, racism. And so it was uncharted territory for me. And I remember printing out, how do you engage in these things? And a couple of the elements they listed was be willing to have uncomfortable conversations, and be willing to be uncomfortable. You will be uncomfortable, you should be uncomfortable, but also be willing to speak your truth. If for example, we're going to really heal, it's like a marriage. If I'm only listening to my wife, if I have concerns, I'm only listening to my wife and I work on those, but I also have those concerns, then we're not going to be as healthy as if we're both comfortable sharing what our thoughts and concerns are, just like any relationship. But I just want to give you two examples. And I say that because it gives me gooseflesh that were relayed to me. One was, and I don't think he'll mind me saying his name. If he does, I don't think he's on, so he can beat me up later. Leon Covington was one on our Police Faith Alliance committee. And, He shared a comment with me once when we were talking that he was at, I believe, Francis and Division in his car. It was nighttime. And he said, pulled up to a red light. There's a police car right there. And he said, the police officer did not want to look at him. He just did not want to look at him. I don't know who the officer was. I'm speculating the officer didn't want to necessarily get accused of, I don't want to be accused of profiling or looking at him and see if he's got warrants. So the officer didn't make contact. Well, the light stayed red for a while. So finally, at one point, the officer kind of glanced over and Leon said he waved to him, nice friendly wave. He said he could literally, from his car at night, see the relief in the officer's eyes as the officer waved back to him. I use that as an example, and it's a sad testament that part of our reality is we anticipate we are going to be met with anger, hostility, frustration. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just being completely honest. Second one, this just happened recently. And I'll say the caveat, every shooting we have is, and I mean this sincerely, our policy says all life is sacred. I believe that. There's a shooting that someone was standing on the corner out here at Monroe in Broadway with a sign protesting. My wife was in uniform, patrol captain, walking back from lunch with a civilian. And the guy with the sign saw a car with 4 African-Americans in it stopped at Monroe in Broadway. And the guy with the sign protesting the shooting started pointing to the car full of these 4 African-Americans and then said, "She will shoot you, she will kill you," and started yelling at this car and pointing to Tracy, say, "She will kill you." Light turned green, they drove off, and she said all 4 of them waved at her somewhat apologetically. And like, "Yeah, we're sorry that happened." It sounds trivial, but it is just the simple wave like that, like, "Hey, sorry the guy's acting that way." I mean, I'm getting gooseflesh right now just thinking about it. Those small things, they add up. I have a little sticky note here from George Washington. Many mickles make a muckle. And if you get a lot of those over and over again, that's just one thing that can help. And we have our role and we will embrace our role. But from the community's perspective, little things like that go miles, especially if they experience that repeatedly.
And thanks for sharing that, Chief Meidel. And that was related to another question that we got from the audience. And I'll just say that the question, part of the question was, when we encounter these fears that we have, as you've recounted with the officer and the exchange with the gentleman at the stoplight, if we change the conversation to commonalities instead, we can relate as fellow humans. Now, how can we do this? And have you seen examples in our community and elsewhere? And I'll pose this to the other panelists.
And so I'm going to chime in on my way out the door. It's about that time. So I really appreciate being able to engage with you all and being able to bring my son in here with you into this very challenging and difficult conversation. And thanks for making space for that. One thing I want to kind of highlight about this whole thing is that, there are at least a couple of things that I've seen that are consistently at play. Number one, it is the propensity towards resistance of change, right? So, and that's a universal principle. And so what I've seen manifest time and time again is that it finds several reasons to justify that. And there's several causes for that resistance even being a thing that's a struggle for any group or individual. I think that what we have manifesting on both sides of this issue is a lot of fear, right? As was just named. Fear of change, fear of lack of control, because the reality is police officers have been trained to be in control. That is a core foundation of some of that culture, right? And what they're seeing and what some of this invitation is like, hey, you need to let go of some of that or figure out a different way to manifest that other than what you've been generationally used to doing, right? As a culture. On the other side of that, we have the impact of communities as well. And we are dealing with a multi-generational cultural resentment. I'm going to just tell you that's real, because when you take a look at what's actually happened with communities of color here in the Americas, there has been a very intentional cultural stripping. And a lot of the manifestation of that is has been implemented through the police vehicle, right? And I'm not necessarily talking in recent times, but I'm talking about the whole historical view. And so when we talk about the fear that we're now having, right, is we're being asked to trust this organization that has said, hey, we want to change, we want to do better, we're humans, we didn't set this stuff up, we're just trying to deal with it like you are. Yet, we're dealing with a lot of fear about, is that true? And especially when we do things like we turn on the media and we're seeing our Black and brown people gunned down at will, and the officers barely, if ever, being held accountable. right? So we just have to understand that as we continue this conversation, those things are at play. I thank you for your time. Thanks for being here.
And
Craig,
Mr.
Betsy,
Robinson,
yes, sir.
Mr. Robinson, thank you. As you leave tonight, though, could you share an example of a conversation that you've had in our community that relates to us, each other as fellow human beings, as you leave tonight, and something that we can take with us tonight as an encouragement in our efforts to treat each other as God intended?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we've got the gentleman sitting right here in the space, Chief Milo. He and I have had multiple conversations. What I'll point you to is some of the conversations that happened, I believe, last year, between the NAACP and SPD, where there were a whole host of complaints. We're always getting complaints, right? It's not a new thing, but there were several of them that were like back to back to back that were SPD related. And how we responded as an organization was we initially, hey, we had dialogue, Chief, what's going on? Here's the complaints that are coming through. We're not giving any names, but here's what the situation is. Can you look into it? He was very fidelic about doing so, came right back to us and said, hey, the story on some of these that I'm getting is not how you're telling it. And so let's get together and let's figure that out. Right? And so that's pretty historic for both of our organizations to actually, number one, have dialogues like that. Number two, sit down or even contemplate sitting down and talking it out. And then number three, do it. Because we ran through all those markers. And what we found, if I'm not mistaken, at least one or two out of 3 or 4 were just not the story that we were told. And we were able to view evidence that absolutely set that very clear. And so, and that's just one of the most visceral things. But one of the also things that we had is the conversation just the other week with the chief and the mayor and city council, where we had some real talk about how race is an issue, and that if we're going to do anything meaningful at this stage of the game, then we need to have that be a foundational understanding and communication amongst all of us, and start moving forward from that reality instead of continuing to circle around trying to figure that one out. Hey, race is an issue. Let's move forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for participating this evening too. Much appreciated.
Yeah. That's
and
it.
Any other comments from the panelists on that particular question about relating to each other as fellow humans? And any examples that you would like to share as
so much of this, Mark, of what this is coming down to, this discussion, is the ability to have back and forth communication. And Zoom certainly has advanced that cause during COVID, but the face-to-face communication conversation is always more effective. And I certainly look forward to a day when we aren't as reliant upon Zoom as we have been. But that kind of communication is so critical. And it's a communication by 2 parties, both parties having responsibility to actively engage and to actively lay their concerns on the table.
And at this point, I do want to encourage the audience, if you have a question that you'd like the panelists to address, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom. And we'll try to take those questions as they come. Thank you for that. And Mark, Kenny, I'll turn to you. I think we have a couple other questions. You have a couple questions that perhaps would like to pose to the panelists.
I have a question I'm curious about. For people who've been in Spokane for a while, they know that we used to have an ombudsman system, and it had various different levels of authority. Do you think that there is value in pursuing something that in the future to settle some of these things, or have we moved to a different method of accountability that works better?
I'll just personally say, I think the ombudsman that we have, and that was kind of reconcile that role in the last police contract, is still needed. But a lot of the conversations and issues really could be, as Curtis said, relationship between the NAACP or the Hispanic Association, if they had that relationship, just to reach out to the chief and say, Chief, this is what we're hearing in our community, and he could say, well, let me look into that. But I have to just end my comment with, when I first came on council, I did a couple of ride-alongs with the police department, and I kept those officers' numbers, and I periodically just reach out to them to check in. When the Chauvin verdict came in, one was an African American police officer. I just say, hey, how are you doing? Because they're in an environment and a system, where they got the double whammy. They Black and a police officer at the same time. So it's all of our people in blue. And I just want to make sure that the police are safe and the people that they serve are safe. So yes, both. To keep the ombudsman, make that stronger, but those community engagements will make that a lot better in the long run.
Anybody else on that?
Yeah, and thank you, Councilwoman Wilkerson. Yeah, Councilwoman Wilkerson has been supportive, and again, she's elected to represent all the people, including their concerns. So, and she has been supportive. I know shortly after, I think it was May or June, when you started to really hear this wave of defund the police, I think within days of that really reaching its peak, she would publicly said, we're not going to defund the police. That's not what we're looking to do. So we appreciate that support. It sounds probably like it's not a big deal, but that resonates with the department when they know, okay, this council member is not interested in doing, and I'm not saying any of them are, but when they say that, and they say that publicly, that goes a long way as well. So we appreciate that. As far as civilian oversight, yeah, this day and age, you have to have it, and I'll tell you that in the conversations with the guild president, he's even said, we know we need it. We need it for that level of legitimacy of having that outside review of investigations. Somebody can go to and make a complaint, and they'll take you seriously. So the guild leadership has acknowledged we need it. I will say absolutely yes, we need it. And even if you had an agency in this day and age anywhere USA that felt like they did everything right, just community expectations have evolved. 21st century policing is completely different than it was even 20 years ago. And so it is here to stay. I think those states that may not have a robust civilian oversight program, I anticipate you're going to see over time that is going to just pretty much be a part of law enforcement in the United States.
Okay, you did touch on the defunding the police versus police reform. I think most people feel that, or at least I feel that defunding the police hasn't been a helpful notion with regard to making progress for police reform. Councilmember Wilkerson, Chief, said that you did come out and clarify that you're not for defunding the police. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yep, I came out and said, I'm not going to defund the police, because you know what? When I call the police, I want them to show up, especially at my house. I have neighbors, and if I need help, they're the ones I'm going to call. So for me, how do I look at policing? So again, I come out of the mental health arena. On my ride along, and when this officer talked to me about what they see every day on the job, kids killed, car accidents, all those things. I understand trauma. And I said, in the contract, I want to make it mandatory when they witness something like that they have to take time off, that they just can't go home, go to bed, get up and go back to work the next day. That is one way of me reimagining policing. I'm reimagining policing again, expanding that mental health component. We had a presentation from Frontier Behavioral Health. It's how do we have more of those clinicians out in the community with our officers, and let them, when it's not a situation where it's life or death, let them take the lead. Because usually people are hurting when they call the police. There is some type of trauma, And even though the officers have had that training, 40 hours is not like a clinician out in the field. That's another way. Community policing. I would like policing back in our neighborhoods. Um, that's a big push with Councilmember Cathcart and myself. So neighborhood gets to know who their police officers are. They see them at the grocery store. They can say hi because when you're in, this is me, we interact when we see a person in a uniform and when I just see them as my neighbor.
Hmm.
Relationship building starts when I see them as my neighbor or at the coffee stand. And then I see them in their suit. Because you know, they have to come out of that suit at some time. And they are people. And I want to acknowledge that and all of them. So that's my first blush.
That's kind of like the Mr. Rogers approach to relationships with our law enforcement, isn't it? Do you want
Yes,
to be my
it is.
neighbor?
I want you to be my neighbor. And I've been thinking about how could we come up with a program to incentivize police officers to live in neighborhoods. You know, I would love to have a police next door to me as my neighbor. So that's something else on my back percolator, especially with the housing challenge.
And Mark, any other questions from you at this
I
point?
do have one for the chief. You talked in your remarks earlier about policing standards and how they can exist at various levels, certainly at the local level, the state level, standards for training and conduct. Can you tell us more about the national standard for policing and if you think there should be one?
Yeah, so the best way I typically describe it is, you know, police departments are like people. You're all people, but you're all unique. You're still a person. We would call you a person, but you have your own uniqueness. And law enforcement agencies are different, maybe not as different as one person to the next, but we have different hiring standards. We have different requirements. We have different academies depending on what state you go to, although it's uniform here in Washington. Different discipline standards, different thresholds. Some states, a sheriff or a chief can get rid of any officer or deputy at any time. You have no right to appeal that decision. Others, they have civil service rights. They have binding arbitration, mediation. It's the type of people you hire. We require over a year of college. Some people think we should require 4 years. We believe that our trickle will turn into a drop if we require that. Sheriff's office right now, they require no college at all. You'll find other agencies in Washington State that say you have to have a 4-year bachelor's degree. So the standards are different. In terms of having uniform national standards, it is one of those things where I think there should be a minimal foundation, you know, regardless of where you're a police officer, there are certain things you absolutely should have. However, some of these agencies, especially the agencies that can't pay as much, if you start getting to the rural areas or start getting some of these other areas in the country where they have zero tax base, the more requirements you have, they're just not going to be able to fill their positions. So I think you have to find that happy balance between here's the minimal requirements that we may be able to do in 3 months, which is what it was when I was hired, versus some of these other areas where community expectations are higher and they're willing to support that through paying money out of their pocket. So now ours is 4.5 months plus a 3-week post academy. So the short version, yep, absolutely. There should be some minimal standards, but we also have to understand some of these jurisdictions. If you put too many standards on them, they're not going to get anybody. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. That's why you have those minimal standards. But they struggle as it is. And just a real quick caveat, you know, right now we don't have law enforcement recruiting is down. So we're authorized 356 positions. And we have about 15 vacancies right now that we're looking to fill in the fall academy. We have 9 officers that are attending the academy. We have 8 officers in the FTO program or probation, meaning we can't use them yet because they're not off probation. And then we have 6 officers that are off on medical or vacationing out. So when you look at the 356, we have 47 positions on the books right this second that we can't use because they're training, they're retiring. They're in the academy. And we anticipate that 6 that are going to be gone, retired probably within the next month, month and a half, may actually increase to another 5 to 10. I just throw that out caveat. I wanted to put that in there that, we're almost at 50 positions on the books that we really can't use for patrol. Love community policing. We got to get these positions filled. And thankfully we have, we are not lowering our standards. We're getting amazing people, but we don't have the quantity. So we'll keep plugging along on that.
Chief Meidel, I'm reminded of the movie Serpigo. I don't know if you ever saw that movie with, can't remember the actor who played the lead, Al Pacino, right? So how many officers right now are under some type of disciplinary proceeding? Of the total officers available for duty, how many officers are either under investigation or in a disciplinary proceeding with the department?
At any time, you may have, so understand that they can take from the day the complaint is filed until it's actually resolved. It can take, we have up to 6 months per the contract. So they can take quite a while. I'm spitballing. I don't have a list.
It'll hold you to a specific
Yeah,
number. Can you give me a percentage, an idea of percent of the officers?
3%.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right. But it's 2 or 3% that potentially could see their tenure with the
No.
department end. Huh?
No, not so much. A lot of them are going to be what we call inadequate response. Officer responded, and the officer didn't either respond how they should have, or they didn't respond in a way the community member wanted them to, because the law didn't allow them to, policy didn't allow them to. Some of them may be what we call, and those also include preventable collisions. Our number one cause of collision, and we do this training consistently, pulling out parking lots. That's a discipline decision. You scraped a car, it's just rub off. That's still a preventable collision. You're going to get disciplined. So it runs the full gamut from parking lot scrapes to inadequate responses to a lot of ours are internal complaints. Our internal complaints are up this year as well. And there's good and bad with that. An increase in internal complaints could be a sign of a toxic culture within an agency when you see a boatload of internal complaints. Or it could be that the culture.
Are those things like perhaps like harassment, sexual harassment, verbal abuse, those types of things?
None of those right now. Mainly, an officer didn't do what they're supposed to. They didn't turn in a report when they're supposed to. They didn't follow the direction of a supervisor. They didn't, they didn't put property on when they were supposed to. They waited the next day or the next week. It could be even a supervisor who sees someone, driving too fast, for example. So again, it's either you can look at that as, man, that's a toxic culture. They're eating each other alive, or no, they're actually kind of changing the culture and they're holding each other to that higher standard. And at some level, that's what it looks like at the beginning of that culture change is those complaints go up as well.
And I think you kind of,
Could you tell people?
by the way, just a time check, we're approaching 8:45. We'll go to, if it's all right with the panelists, till 9 o'clock this evening. Is that all right?
Yeah, I've got a couple hours. I'll stay on.
We may end before that, but there are a few more questions from the audience that I'd like to cover too. Go ahead, Mr. Hissel.
Chief, could you tell people the process of hiring a new officer and the screenings, not only the screening steps, but those that fall out of the system, how difficult it is? I think most people don't appreciate how difficult it is to find and hire.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. So right now we have, and our numbers are high. This is very unusual, about 120 new hire applicants interested in being police officers. Traditionally, we have hired about 1 out of every 8 to 10 that we interview, because of background, because of decision-making, because during their oral board, they give them scenarios, because we ask them things like, the values of SPD, and they don't know the values. So we hire about 1 out of every 8 to 10. So we hear a list of 120 people, like, that's fantastic. You have 120 people. No, if probably 12 to 15, if we're lucky. Lateral is not quite as many. So we do what Chief Straub was the chief here. He came from Indianapolis, and he made the comment that the background was the equivalent of what you would need for a secret clearance through the federal government. And again, as part of my role, I get that done through the FBI for a number of different reasons. They interview neighbors, family members, past employees. They ask your references for other references. They do a home visit. They look at your social media accounts. They do the full gamut, anything, everything. They look at your bank account. They look at everything. Then they go and you do a battery of about 5 different psychological tests. If you pass, we say, okay, we're going to continue forward. So that doesn't mean 120 go forward. That's where we really start losing a lot of folks in that initial screening. 5 battery of tests with the psychologist. They have been validated. Most of them are based on a California Post, and then an interview with him. And then we do what's called a polygraph. And the polygraph really is to find out, did you tell us everything? And we lose people through the polygraph as well. And then once they're hired, we can lose them through the academy because we get to know them better, or we can lose them the FTO card. They make poor decisions. They don't interact with the public. I could talk for hours about this, and I'm going to just take 5 seconds instead. We hired one kid. Now, the new generation loves to be on their phone with communication. We hired one kid, great kid. I call him a kid. He's 22. But he was on a burglary call, and he kept asking the victim over and over the questions. And finally, the guy looks at the FTO and says, and pardon the French, but he says, what the hell is his problem? And so a lot of our kids now, they're used to communicating and arguing and breaking up and disputing over text. So those are the types of issues that will cause people to wash out as well. Thank you for the question.
And along those lines, one of the questions we received tonight was, what can the community specifically do to help law enforcement agencies recruit more qualified, capable individuals for careers in this profession, especially within the communities of color?
Yeah, it's a struggle right now, and it's especially related to community of color because of the national dialogue that's occurring right now. Last year, so we use a company called Public Safety Testing. They're a national company. Their tests have been vetted to make sure that there's no bias included in their tests. You can take the test in Florida and check the box for Spokane PD. You can take the test in Oregon or Texas. And so we are on any public safety testing they can apply here. We have gone to the colleges. We've gone to non-traditional law enforcement courses, sociology, biology, accounting. We've gone to sports teams. We've gone to the military base. We go to job fairs outside of the Spokane area. In other states, we go to all women job fairs. And last year, let me back up. If we don't see the results of the test, civil service gets that. If they pass, civil service puts their name on a list. So last year, civil service forwarded us for all of 2020, a total of 12, and I'll use as an example, African-Americans, 12 African-Americans for the full year. And this is despite us going to all of these areas. And again, I'm not blaming, with all the experiences and dialogue that's current, I'm not expecting them necessarily to be anxious to line up for our kind of organization. But we are trying to go to those places, including non-traditional places. It is just a national issue right now, but encouraging folks that you would like to see in uniform. Who would you want to respond to your house if you were a victim? If you were in Florida on vacation and someone broke into your house, who would you want going through your house, making sure nobody's there, and you trust they're not going to walk off with a watch or some loose change or something like that, and encourage them to apply. I just promise you, if they are squared away, we will be hiring, because we just think that our numbers we'll continue to see vacancies as folks retire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I could follow up, we did have a question from someone, and I'm not familiar with this. In Seattle, they apparently have something called an officer early warning intervention system. Do we have that here as well?
We do. Ours is through Blue Team. Yeah.
And it's probably similar, but not the same as theirs?
I don't know. There's a lot of different platforms for internal affairs. Ours is, we call IA Pro. So I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with what Seattle's system is.
Okay, you just to follow up, you did talk about all these ways we screen folks before they get on the force, which is excellent. But there is a method for monitoring folks as they do serve, and that would be one way. Yeah, the early intervention system with IA Pro, what it does is that it will automatically, regardless of if a complaint is founded, it's a complaint, it's uses of force, it's pursuits, it's collisions, and they set a threshold, and we can set that threshold. Regardless, founded or not founded, once one is entered in and it passes that threshold, there's a flag in internal affairs. They then pull that entire case file, all of those pursuits, complaints, uses of force, collisions, and then they have the lieutenant review that and determine, is there something here more that we need to do with this officer,
Or is it in looking at these? No, he was a backup on that call. He was there. We looked at the body camera. We investigated use of force. It was within policy, and there's nothing different we could have done. But what my expectation is through the review of those, and every use of force gets another review outside misconduct. And we call that a use of force review board. They meet once a month. They review every use of force. And what their role is, okay, this has been through the chain of command, or this has been through an administrative review panel. There's no policy violations, but despite that, is there something better we could have done? So that's kind of what we do with our early intervention system as well. We have the shift commander take the lead on that with the sergeant. And the reason we wanted to do that is they're supposed to be monitoring the behavior and performance of the officer. And if we have IA or someone else do it, it's like, nope, if this officer is engaging in too many of these things, you're going to get extra work. So you need to be aware of not only what they are, but you're going to hold them accountable. And that's your responsibility. You wanted the promotion, you asked for it, no one forced you. Now you need to step up and be the supervisor we need you to be.
Oh, thank you.
And perhaps this might be our last question. I'm sorry, Mr. Hislop, did you want to comment? Okay, so our last question for the evening came out of the previous forums that we've had with the professors from Washington State University, and they've been mentioned on a couple of occasions this evening. A study by Professors James and James indicate that there's the difficulties in interactions between law enforcement officers and the public can be attributed to sleep deprivation issues that occur due to officers working extended hours or shifts. In some cases, double shifts, and I'd like you to comment on that. How serious a problem is sleep deprivation? And also the issue about accidents that involve officers. And what steps are being taken to address those things?
Absolutely. And I apologize, Councilwoman Wilkerson. I definitely don't want to hog the whole conversation. So we limit, we do not allow double shifts. We limit to, I want to say it's 16 hours. An officer's patrol shift is 10 hours and 40 minutes. We allow them to, in essence, work. It might even actually be 4 hours. The most we'll let them work is 5. In other words, half of another shift. We don't allow double shifts, so they may work 15 hours. Sleep is a huge issue, and it is a huge issue all across America in every profession. We are a coffee addict, nicotine. I got nicotine gum in right now. We love our stimulants across the nation. The difference is, and I heard Dr. Marks say this when I took some implicit bias training in Moses Lake. He said the difference is law enforcement is a unique position of having the ability to take away freedoms, to use deadly force, to make decisions that significantly impact others. So while it may affect implicit bias, sleep deprivation may affect other people, you have a unique position. You need to be mindful of that. We actually have instructors come in and do wellness training at in-services. And I'll give you a quick example. He put nutrition as a box. He put exercise as a box, but a bigger box he put was sleep. And the reason he did that is he said that doctors are starting to realize that the bigger impact on society in law enforcement is that lack of sleep. And we know that law enforcement, because of shift work, they get lack of sleep. It is an issue, especially you work at night. Maybe you had a hot call just before you're secured. You still got maybe that adrenaline, or you're still wired. It can take you a while to get to sleep. And most of us are not made to be nocturnal. We're not made to stay awake at night. We have people that love working nights. I think they're nuts because it's counterintuitive to our biology. So we do look at that. We've done wellness training. We are amping up our wellness training. We've been behind the ball. I really started pushing it 3 years ago, and we have a ways to go on it. We really do. There's no way of getting around officers getting the sleep that they should get because of the shift work. We can encourage, we can prod, but in the end, as adults, they go home. We can't control what they do. I do believe, and I've heard this from officers who've been on night shift for a while. It's like, I'm glad I got off because you deal with a different community on nights versus day shift. The types of calls you go on, the interactions, the sleep that you can get. So right now, officers are allowed to bid their shift by seniority, and they can stay on nights for as long as they want. I think me and most of my executive staff agree that, it sure would be nice to limit that to 3 years, maybe 5 at the most, but I'd prefer something like 3 years. Then you have to go to a different shift for at least 1 year. I would love it. And I think you'd see a lot more folks wanting to get off that night shift, because after a while you feel miserable all the time and you forget what it's like. You think that's just how everyone feels.
Would the police union be open to those suggestions?
I think so. I'm not saying they would agree. They would be open to the conversation. And especially if we had data that would support that. So far, for almost everything I've gone to them, they haven't said flat out no. They said, well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the impact.
Does the police union kind of direct these conversations, or how much give and take is there?
So the law says any change in working conditions are mandatory subjects of bargaining. So mandating a change in shifts would be a subject to bargaining. Wages, pay, discipline. If we change the discipline matrix, this is across the nation. That's a change in working conditions. That's a mandatory subject of bargaining. That means we have to sit down and bargain out that impact. Certain things are not. Like beards, they want to try beards. I said, we'll try beards for 6 months. I want to see what the community thinks. I want to see what you think. I don't have to negotiate that. Uniforms, we can pick whatever uniforms we want. Vehicles, vehicle colors.
So, Council Member Wilkerson, how much input can the public or influence can the public have to bring the parties to conclusions about making changes as we've discussed, particularly as it regards to shifts and working, night shifts on a consistent basis, and then also extra hours?
Well, being in the healthcare field in my real life, I've had employees have to pull a double shift, and really it's diminished return. You can only give so much and you just got nothing left. And you do interact under stress differently when you're tired. I have found myself a little testy when I'm tired, where maybe in another case, I would have had a little bit more patience. So I certainly would lean in, and the community should, if we care about our officers, and we do, we really want the best working conditions for them also. I know being short-staffed, especially during COVID, has been challenged, because in healthcare, we've all pulled double shifts because people have been sick or whatever reason. But I think the more the community knows, the more we can weigh in and bring that leverage to bear to be supportive of those types of changes, and and shine a spotlight on it. A lot of these things happen that we as a community don't know because it's in that system. And as a community person, we're not in that system. So till that comes out, we have no way to lean in to be more supportive. But yeah, get some sleep.
And on that note, I think that's an appropriate place to end our conversation this evening. I very much appreciate, on behalf of PEG, the panelists' participation. Thank you so much for this important discussion. And thank you to the audience for your participation. We hope you enjoyed this evening's event, found it informative and thought-provoking, and that you will join us again soon. Our next forum will be in September 2021, after a brief summer break. A video of tonight's event will be posted on our website at www.pegnow.org within a couple of weeks. In the meantime, you're invited to visit our website and view previous PEG public forums, as Mr. Hislop did. Thank you for that, in promoting our really wonderful library of videos. They're really outstanding presentations, and I do hope you'll take advantage of them and find out more about our goals and objectives. We hope you will invite others to visit our website as well. And also, please feel free to leave us a message on our website and/or join PEG as a member. We'd love to have you. You can join through the membership link on our website. Thank you all, and we wish you a very good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.